Teach me about the Great Lakes. Teach me about the Great Lakes. Welcome back to Teach Me About the Great Lakes, a twice-monthly podcast in which I, a Great Lakes novice, ask people who are smarter and harder working than I am to teach me all about the Great Lakes. My name is Stuart Carlton. I work with Illinois Indiana Sea Grant, and I know a lot about the feeling where you ride your bike into work, planning to go out to dinner with the new department head, all excited about that, and realize that you left your bike lock at home, so now you have to decide whether or not to ride all the way back home before going to dinner, or to ride to Target and get a cheap bike lock and spend the whole dinner wondering if your bike is going to be stolen or not. But I don't know a lot about the Great Lakes. And so that's the point of this podcast. I'm joined today by the one, the only, the special Megan Gunn. Megan, what's up?
Nothing much, Stuart. I'm excited for sunshine and being back on the podcast after taking a long hiatus.
Yes. Too long. Your hiatus was too long. Yeah. Well, we're super pumped to have you back. That is definitely true. And fired up in action. And so, I think today, let's just jump right into it. There was an issue. I'll give a little background and then we'll do the thing. But so there were we just had a paper that's about to come out in the Journal of Great Lakes Research that I was working on with a postdoc, Becca Nixon, and another colleague of mine, Xiao Ma. And Becca led this whole deal, but it got accepted. And then once your paper gets accepted, what you do is you refresh the journal page every 90 to 120 seconds. To see if it's up there yet, because it's still fun to see your name in print. And so I was doing that, refreshing like mad. I've got, refreshal tunnel syndrome or whatever on my finger. And I saw a really neat paper in the journal that had nothing to do with what we were talking about. The paper's called Drawing on Anishinaabeg Knowledge to Protect Water. It was talking about like this water protection plan being developed in the Whitefish River First Nation up in northern Ontario. And I thought this was really neat and touches on a lot of things I wanted to talk to. So I reached out to the author. Her name is Laura Lee McGregor. And she was kind enough to come on. So I'm really fired up about this interview.
Me too. I am so excited, especially because I've been thinking a lot, not like in the last year or so, but especially in the last couple of weeks, like how Indigenous peoples survived in the environment for thousands and thousands of years without conflict. And so what can I do, having grown up in this Western world, what can I do now as a single person to better interact with the environment?
Yeah. Because
like you have these individuals that are doing things, but us as individuals, like we make a big difference. And so
no, I agree.
Lots of thoughts.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I think it's a great conversation, or I would think it if we had it already. But since we're recording this beforehand, of course, I imagine it will be a great conversation. And I imagine that I'm looking forward to hearing it. Our guest today is Dr. Laura Lee McGregor. She's an assistant professor of Indigenous health at the Northern Ontario School of Medicine, which I'm happy to report is Canada's first independent school of medicine. Laura Lee, how are you today?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Great. So where is that anyway? Where is Northern Ontario? So I'll be honest, I don't know a lot about Canada other than what I've learned from Carolyn. And so when I hear Northern anything in Canada, I'm thinking it's in the middle of not a lot. Is that fair about the Northern Ontario School of Medicine?
Well, actually, the School of Medicine is located in Sudbury, Ontario. And if you were looking at a map of Ontario, you would see that it's actually not in the northern part of the province. I would say, if I was looking at a map, I would say it's kind of actually maybe in the middle of the province. But when people give names to places, it's all based on, urban centric. So anything north of Toronto is north, right?
Yeah, I have some friends in New York State, and the debate over where upstate is, anything north of New York City is upstate New York, at least according to people in New York. Fair enough. So you're not too, so is Sudbury, is it like a lot of people there, or is it kind of?
Sudbury, the greater Sudbury area, the population is about 130,000, so not heavily populated, but that includes, they used to be their towns on their own, but everything got amalgamated. I forget when that happened, in the 1990s maybe, but so it's quite spread out. So Sudbury is quite spread out, but it's one of the largest urban centers in this area. I'll say, want to say Northern Ontario, but it's really not Northern Ontario.
Really not Northern Ontario.
Well, the folks who are actually from Northern Ontario would be like, that ain't Northern Ontario. But I don't actually live in Sudbury. I used to live in Sudbury when my daughter was going to high school there, but I actually live in my home community of Whitefish River First Nation, which is about an hour and 10-15 minutes from Sudbury. So I don't live in the city anymore. I live in the sticks on the res.
Sticks on the res. That's great. Do you have to go in to teach then, or is it all virtual because of COVID stuff, or how's that work?
It has been virtual for the past 2 years, but since February we're back in person. So but I don't teach every day. We have just a very unique kind of teaching module. We teach in modules, and the module that I'm primarily responsible for and teach quite a bit in is coming up. It's starting in at the end of this month, so I'll be there much more frequently than I have been. But the bad weather and snow days and icy and freezing rain is mostly over, so I don't the travel's not too bad. It's nothing when you live in rural areas. Like an hour and 10-minute drive is like it's nothing.
One thing I love about West Lafayette is we don't have that. We have so we have about the same number of people. We're probably in the greater Lafayette area, probably 150K, something like that. And but I have a 14-minute bike ride in, and so it's nice. Especially now I got this electric bike, which I talk about every third episode, so I won't talk about it now.
Yeah, when I used to live in Sudbury, I lived close enough to either bike or walk to school, but that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen right now.
No, I imagine it's nice to be back out in the sticks though too. So the Whitefish River First Nation. Tell me a little bit about this. So this is an Indigenous community in that area, right? Is that was it? Have they been there? For time immemorial, or what's the history of them in the area?
So I would say time immemorial. I mean, we do have our creation stories that talk about not exactly when we got to this area, but essentially, there's a phrase we would say in our language, mi weoje, which is like a long time ago. People actually came from the east. That's in our creation story. But we've been in this area for thousands of years. There's archaeological evidence for us being here, I think 10 to 12,000 years. So
that's incredible.
So Whitefish River First Nation, it's one of 7 First Nations that are part of the Manitoulin First Nations. For those who are somewhat familiar with geography in Ontario, so I live very close to Manitoulin Island. So Manitoulin Island is quite well known in Ontario. It's I think it's the largest freshwater island in the world.
No kidding.
Yeah. It's like to drive from one end to the other would probably take you at least 3 hours.
Wow.
At least 3 hours. Mm-hmm. And so there are communities that we believe we're affiliated with. There's lots of relationships through marriage and things like that among the communities. But my community of Whitefish River is not technically on Manitoulin Island. Would be kind of like on the peninsula, or no, it's whatever, some kind of geographic body form that connects the island to the mainland. And so we're surrounded. So Manitoulin Island is located within Lake Huron, Georgian Bay. And so we're connected to both on the west, there's a large body of water called the Bay of Islands, and to the east is McGregor Bay, which is actually, I'm looking out over McGregor Bay right now.
Wow.
And yes, it is named after my family.
Really?
That was going to be my next question.
There's a long story there. Well, it was a Scottish trader named Alexander McGregor who he had a trading post in this area in the I want to say probably the early 1800s, and so he married one of Chief Shawanossaway's daughters, and then I mean that happened quite a bit during that time period. Traders like that would, not saying that there wasn't any love, but it was like very strategic relationships, right?
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, that's where the McGregor name comes from, because sometimes people go like, you're Indigenous and your last name is McGregor. Well, that doesn't make sense. And I'm like,
that's true. It's not a traditional Indigenous surname, is it?
No. Yeah. But anyway, that's the story of why McGregor.
Well, that is interesting. And I'm looking at pictures now on the internet, and this place is beautiful. So I'm now envious.
We have it's very well known. Like, we have actually a lot of folks from the States who have cottages in this area. There's into McGregor Bay and Bay of Finn, there's yachts in there all the time in the summer. So it's pretty nice here. It's pretty.
Yep. Yeah, it looks stunning, frankly. I don't actually own a yacht, but if I were to, I would take it there.
Lots of canoeists and kayakers too, so in our budget range.
Right, yeah, basically. Stretch budget. But so that brings us, so the reason we brought you on to talk today actually is so you have this paper that's coming out in the Journal of Great Lakes Research called Drawing on Anishinaabe Knowledge to Protect Water. And so this came out and it really struck my interest because it's just what you're talking about. So the indigenous peoples, the Whitefish River First Nation, has been there for thousands of years, but the area had to come up with a water protection plan for some reason, right? And it seems like they completely excluded the First Nations. Is that right? Do you want to give us a little background on the Sudbury Water Protection Plan process, and then we can go from there?
Well, we'd have to go back to 2002 when there was a small community in southwestern Ontario called Walkerton. And what happened there was their water treatment plant wasn't operating correctly, and 7 people ended up dying, and over 2,000 people got sick from the E. coli basically in the water. So it was obviously a big tragedy. And following that, there was a provincial inquiry, and actually one of the provincial Indigenous lobby groups, they made a submission as part of the inquiry, and actually my sister, Dr. Deborah McGregor, was part of that submission to the Walkerton inquiry. But essentially, what came out of it is that there needs to be better guidelines and regulations around safe drinking water. And in 2000, and I think it was 6, the province came out with the Clean Water Act, and part of that Clean Water Act was having these planning areas, these where they could develop these source water protection plans. And so there's 19 in Ontario. And so the one that's geographically closest to my community is the Sudbury one. And they do have, or they did have 2 First Nations as part of that planning process. So there's 2 communities very close to the city of Sudbury. There's a Tikmek-Shing Anishinaabeg, and there's Wanapate First Nation. But I'm not exactly sure why Whitefish River First Nation was not involved in that planning process. It could have been, so I have a couple of theories myself about why this happened. One is if you're looking strictly on a map, you wouldn't necessarily think that Whitefish River First Nation, they probably looked at the reserve boundaries and said, oh, well, it's not going through the reserve at all. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't apply to them. Even though it's the Whitefish River watershed was one of the watersheds that they looked at, and we're called Whitefish River First Nation.
I mean, it's right there in the name, right? Yeah.
It's there in the name.
Right.
And, from our perspective, our traditional territory extends well beyond the reserve boundaries. And in the past, we've had actually some land claims that have come through, and maybe they just weren't showing up on the maps yet. And, one arm of the government often does not talk to the other arm of the government, right? So they maybe we're just not aware of it. The other thing, like my theory, is that the community might have been invited to be part of it, but it was kind of like maybe got lost in all the other, information that comes into the community. Because we're not only dealing with like local matters here, like the local government doesn't just deal with local matters. You are often dealing with provincial and national and international issues, right? So it's, and we don't have like 100 people working for the First Nation, right? Right. So it might have just got lost that way. Or The other thing I think people often think about too is when they're considering whether to be involved in these types of processes, is whether the process will impact on Aboriginal and treaty rights.
Mm-hmm.
So there's lots of reasons why it might not have happened.
So because you weren't included in that first set of discussions, you decided to do your own thing.
That's right.
So what did that look like? How did that come about?
One of the very interesting things about my community is we have very strong and passionate and educated people who work here, who are from here, who work here. There is people within the administration who felt strongly about this and were able to access funds in order to do this work. I think our community is quite unique. We have a lot of very well-educated people in my community. And yeah, so just wanting to ensure that the waters that are around our community are protected because because we're really surrounded by water. We have
Mm-hmm.
that means we're vulnerable to any contamination that happens, right? And if that, if there's like a devastating whatever spill, it will have a direct impact.
So what is the actual process like? I'm thinking, so we work in extension, and so we get a lot of stakeholder groups together, and it always involves sticky dots. So when you all gathered to try to develop this protection plan, was it a sticky dot situation or a series of meetings? How did that work exactly?
Yeah, there was a number of different ways that the input was got from community members. So there was interviews, there was, focus groups, if you will. There was community meetings where there was, maps up on the wall and people were asked to say like, how did what activities were you doing and related to water. So there's just a number of different ways. We also, I think probably what's different than your sticky dot process too is that ceremony was part of this whole process. So and that's what we do. We do as Anishinaabeg people is ceremony is part of our lives, and so I know that they had at least one water walk as part of this, and they actually, they got the elementary school kids involved, the daycare kids involved. So I would say that information was gathered in different ways that appealed to people. I remember there was like this one community meeting and it was around the fall time, so around fall harvest. And so we had like deer meat and moose meat and wild rice and things like that, right? So lots of people will come out to a feast, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that I think knowing how to reach people is really important. And so we had, a young community researcher in training to to do this kind of on the ground work because it's a lot of work, right? You know how busy these things can be. So it was a real community effort.
I'm not too familiar with water walks, and I'm guessing that many of our listeners aren't either. Or I guess I have two questions. Are there many water walks involved with doing a water protection anything? And what is a water walk? What is that what does that look like?
I'm glad you asked that question. I'm just like talking away like like you would know. So and I'm not even sure how long ago this was, but you can probably Google her. Her name was Josephine Mendaman. She actually passed away a couple of years ago, but she was the one who initiated these called water walks, and she initiated these walks, and she walked around each of the Great Lakes over a course of years. So like one year she would do one lake, and one year she would do another lake. I think one year they walked up the St. Lawrence River.
Wow.
And there was one year where they came from all directions over North America. So essentially the idea is as you're walking along, you're praying for the water for it to heal, because we know that, because of contamination and other human activities, that much of our waters have been contaminated. So it's kind of a ceremony. It's about healing. And as you're walking along, you're actually carrying a copper pail full of water. Yeah. And so, and it's kind of interesting. Anytime you're like, as you're going along, if you pass like a stream or something, like you stop and you would offer tobacco to that stream or that river, and then you continue on. I've been part of a couple of them. I'm not going to say I'm like this major water walker, but when it goes by my community, I would usually participate and help out carrying the water.
That's amazing.
And through making the offering, the idea is that it shows a respect, or how does the offering inform the process, I guess?
Okay, so in our culture, one of our sacred medicines is tobacco, and it's not like we had tobacco a long time ago, and not the commercial.
Right, yeah.
The commercial
the factory tobacco, yeah.
Yeah. So it's considered one of our sacred medicines, and when you're offering tobacco, it's kind of like you're making, you're asking that entity, the spirit of that entity, for help, or to the creator or God for help. So tobacco is really important in Anishinaabe culture. For example, if I wanted to ask an elder something, or I was going to ask them to do a ceremony, I would offer tobacco to them as part of the ask. And in fact, I'm going to do that this week. I asked an elder to come and do a talk at the medical school, and so she said yes, but I'm like, okay, now I got to go and see her to offer the tobacco to her. So we've been emailing back and forth to figure out a time that works for her. Yeah, so the idea is that the water walks are important because we know that the waters are sick, and it's a way to try and help heal them.
So then, bringing it back to the protection plan. So you have this much different, compared to how probably the rest of the Sudbury area did their protection plan, this much different process. And in the result, at the end, you end up with this protection. And so what does that look like, or what does that call for? Can you describe it to us, I guess?
Yeah, I think what's really important about the protection plan is identifies all the different ways that people have and continue to interact with the water. It talks about our responsibilities to the water. So in Anishinaabe culture, water is a women's responsibility. So it's our responsibility to take care of the water. So in ceremonies, it's women who do the water ceremonies. So that, I think, is a real different aspect. And I think this whole process was also important for reminding us about our responsibilities for the water. I think it was also a way to identify, the risks that are out there to our waters, and how those risks can be mitigated. And it's not only external threats, but internal threats, right? So we have a highway running through our community. If there was like a diesel truck that whatever flipped over, like that's an issue, right? So, identifying those threats and how to mitigate them, I think, is part of that community protection plan. And it's not just. I think it's a little different too. It's not just about ensuring that the water is going to be safe for humans to consume, but it's also about, we have all these other organisms that rely on the waters too, right? They're just as important as we are for protecting the water.
So the Sudbury plan, you're covered under the greater area plan as well. I would assume the waters are, or are they not, or are they? Do you know?
There is. What I find odd too is like that there's not a Manitoulin plan,
mm-hmm.
which to me would make sense, but I'm not sure exactly why that didn't happen. It's
lost to the sands of time, I suppose. But so what? I guess so. Looking from the outside, though, so what? Why does the separate planning process matter? I guess what I'm asking is if a lot of the water is going to be protected, though maybe not all of it. What you're doing is additive to that, right? Why is that important and that these voices that were excluded or not included, how about that? Maybe they were excluded, maybe they were just not, active omission, commission. Why is it important to bring out these other voices, do you think?
We, as a community, we can determine what's important to us for ourselves, right? We don't need the province, we don't need the federal government to determine this for us. This process was a way for us to determine, the importance of water and why we need to protect it for ourselves, for our own purposes, right? And I think part of these, ways that information was gathered was really good because, that information was shared amongst a number of different community members who might not have, heard about whatever a spring that was, located in this particular part of the community, or how people, used to interact with the water. So it's a way to share knowledge within our community that really needs to be passed on to ensure that, the younger generations know what it was like. So like I grew up in a time when in my household, we didn't have running water. I was the running water. Well, me and my siblings were the running water, right? When you haul water on a daily basis, you don't waste it.
Mm-hmm.
You do not waste it. So it's just a different way of thinking about water, right? So, my kids are lucky they grew up, they never had to haul water like I did. But important for them to know and understand that, right? Like this water is precious, not to be wasted, not to be, not to be frivolous with, right?
And I think that's a great segue into, I guess, my next question. How can we bridge that gap between what we've been raised up with in Western ways with that traditional ecological knowledge? Like how can we still thrive and, I guess, better live with the environment around us? I've been thinking a lot about this for the last week or so.
That's a really good question. I think it's hard because, the Anishinaabeg worldview about water. I think even for younger folks, it might be maybe a little bit harder to understand. But I mean, younger folks in my community, younger people. I think just recognizing that water is sacred, like it's a sacred entity, that it has, its own life force, um, that it's valuable in and of itself, not because it, gives us drinking water, not because it can be sold, not because it can be contaminated for mines. That it's important to have that relationship with water. I talked about the water walks, but there's certain times when we might do water ceremonies, like when the ice breaks up, we would do a water ceremony. So praying for that water to heal, I think, is really, really important. I think we have a responsibility, and that's one of our teachings, is that we have a responsibility to care for the water, to protect the water, to help heal the waters.
So here, think about bridging that gap, and maybe this gets us too far afield. If so, that's fine. We can just exit. But if I'm in your position, you're nice and calm and maybe kind, and I would be pissed, right? I mean, like under the doctrine of we were here first, if nothing else, and so what you've just described is a very different way of looking at water, right? Compared to sort of the Western way. I almost said traditional Western, but then you could say, I don't know, traditional, right? Okay, compared to on the Western way. At a minimum, most Westerners don't think of water as sacred in that way. We don't think about it at all, frankly. And so, isn't that enraging that people come and push you out and and then they talk about protecting this sacred resource without even consulting you? Like I would just walk around mad all of the time, I guess.
Yeah, I mean that's not going to be helpful, though, right? I mean, in some cases it could be, right? When you're at those particular tables, and hopefully, invited to those tables where they are making decisions about water. But I think that I don't know, I've been around the block. I've been doing, I've been working for First Nations for at least 30 years now. 30 years. So just got to channel that energy differently, right? And I don't, I think things are slowly changing, like Western perspectives are slowly changing about, attitudes toward the environment and water and things like that. I think, but I think for ourselves, it's ensuring that we know that these ceremonies are important and that we're ensuring that they continue to happen, right? So teaching, so for example, we had I think we had must have been last spring when we did the water ceremony. And so, I had my sister-in-law and she had her little granddaughter with her, right? So ensuring that these kind of teachings and knowledge and ceremonies are passed down through the generations, right? So to me, that's really important. I can't control what the federal government does or the provincial government does, but I can control, what happens here in my little territory, right? And that's what I do. Like I can't be too focused on that because it's not going to be helpful.
Well, this is really interesting, and we sure do appreciate you sharing your knowledge and perspective with us. It's really, really valuable. And we'll put a link to the paper in our show notes, which you can find at teachmeaboutthegreatlakes.com/54. And we encourage everybody to go check that out. But actually, Laura Lee, that is not why we invited you on Teach Me About the Great Lakes this week. The reason that we invited you on Teach Me About the Great Lakes is to ask you two questions. The first one is this. If you could choose to have a great donut for breakfast or a great sandwich for lunch, which one would you choose?
Well, I don't eat breakfast, so I guess I'll have a sandwich at lunch.
Sandwich by default. Okay, fair enough. And so when I come to visit either the Northern Ontario, School of Medicine, or the Manitoulin Island, where should I go to get a really good sandwich?
There's some great places on Manitoulin Island. Sugar Bush Cafe, I'll say.
All right, writing it down now. I will arrive in my yacht and they teach me about the Great Lakes yacht. We'll take it there and we'll go up to Sugar Bush Cafe. That's wonderful.
So what is a special place in the Great Lakes that you'd like to share with our audience? And what makes that place special?
There's a really awesome place called Nyabakung. Probably about you can only get there by boat. It's probably about a half-hour boat ride from where I live. And Nyabakung is a sacred mountain, and you park your boat at the bottom of a hill, and it's about a 20-30 minute climb up the hill. But once you get up there, the view is just spectacular. At one time, a mining company wanted to basically mine that mountain to knock it down. And anyway, we reminded them that it's in our territory and that it's sacred and that it's not to be mined. Anyway, it's still there and it's spectacular.
Well, Dr. Laura Lee McGregor, who is, let me get it right, who is an assistant professor of Indigenous Health at the Northern Ontario School of Medicine. Thank you for coming on and teaching us all about the Great Lakes.
Chimigwech, Bama Pi Minwa Kawabmanim.
Well, that was a fascinating interview, fascinating woman on a really complicated issue. And we try to have Indigenous people on as often as we can on Teach Me About the Great Lakes. And I'm always amazed that they don't just walk around pissed off. Like, that's what I would do. Mm-hmm. It's so difficult, sort of the hand that they've been dealt, that we dealt them.
And I like how she said, like, you do walk around pissed off for a little bit, but then you channel that energy into protecting the area.
Yeah, that's more productive, but that sounds good. Excellent. Great. Well, anything cool going on in your neck of the woods? What are you working on these days? We got Freedom Seekers. What else is happening? Or we're about to?
Ooh, I'm actually about to go on a field trip with a local high school, or I guess not local to me, local to us, but with a high school in Northwest Indiana. We're going to go on a field trip and do water quality monitoring with a group of high school students so that they can have a better connection to the Great Lakes. Lake Michigan is right in their backyards. And from what the teacher has said, most, if not all of these students have never been to the lake. So they don't have that appreciation that we do. And just getting them connected, doing some hands-on experiments and follow-up and data, just learning the scientific method. And I'm pumped. This is where I'm putting my passion and my energy.
Oh, well, that's awesome. Anywhere you're putting your passion and energy to is worth putting passion and energy to. No, it's true. I mean, you hear the difference, right, between, I mean, I don't want to be flippant, so take this in the spirit. I mean it, but like you have the guest we just spoke with talking about how the water is sacred, and then on the other hand, you have kids who have not ever even been to the lake, the amazing freshwater resource right there. And so it's just very different. Yeah. Well, that is super fantastic. I can't wait to hear how that goes. Good. Well, let's do the thing, if I can find a thing. There it is. Boom.
Teach Me About the Great Lakes is brought to you by the fine people at Illinois Indiana Sea Grant. We encourage you to check out the great work we do at iiseagrant.org and at ILIN Sea Grant on Facebook, Twitter, and other social media. Teach Me About the Great Lakes is produced by Hope Charters, Carolyn Foley, Megan Gunn, and Irene Miles. Ethan Chitty is our associate producer and fixer. Our super fun podcast artwork is by Joel Davenport. The show is edited by the awesome Quinn Rose, and I encourage you to check out her work at aspiringrobot.com. If you have a question or comment about the show, please email it to teachmeaboutthegreatlakes@gmail.com or leave a message on our hotline at 765-496-IISG. You can follow the show on Twitter at Teach Great Lakes. Thanks for listening and keep grading those lakes.